Hello and welcome to lecture number 6 on Romanesque and Gothic. When last we left off, we talked about at the beginning of the last lecture how the Roman Empire had collapsed. And the reasoning for that, I just wanted you to look at this map for a second because this is a map of barbarian routes. Crossing, invading, attacking, all of these different places in Europe and including the Roman Empire. And so this was a huge factor in pushing the weakened Roman Empire to start to fall apart. But in the beginning, Rome had spent 1,000 years subjugating everyone around them, barbarian tribes across Europe and in every direction around the Roman Empire. And then when Rome finally wasn't able to maintain their empire and the structures of economy and finance that they had created, all of these people who lived around the Roman Empire were left in a vacuum of power and structure for their growing civilization. But they had taken in so much knowledge of architecture and so many other things that there was a huge vacuum. And so imagine if the university closed forever, but everyone still lived in the dorms, and that went on for the next 300 years. What would you have? Chaos. And so that's the time period that is referred to as the Dark Ages, and we don't refer to it as that anymore because so much learning and knowledge did exist and had been spread throughout all of Europe. And the biggest reason that it was considered dark is because this lack of overall authority. And so what happened was there were groups and there were kingdoms. And if you look on the next map, you can see this is another map of a completely different group coming out of where today is Hungary. These are their paths of invasion and attacking stuff. And this is a map of the Vikings invading and attacking stuff. And so you can see that the entire area, everyone in the whole place was like, what are we going to do? This has to end. We need something like the Roman Empire, but it needs to be ours. And so, as we know from last time, in this part of the world, Christianity had risen and was huge throughout the Roman Empire, throughout the Byzantine Empire, and the Romans had helped spread it by the late Roman Empire throughout Europe as well. And one of the biggest goals of the early Catholic Empire was to spread everywhere. Of course, one of the major tenets of Christianity is to spread missionary work everywhere, to everyone. And so what sort of came about is because the Catholic Church sort of had a pre-existing relationship with Rome, which was no more. They took on an authority and they took on a central relationship with royalty and with whoever was in any given place. And as we mentioned in last week's lecture, the Byzantine relationship between strong church and strong government kind of spread along with Christianity through the rest of Europe as well. And so these kingdoms and the church together created this semi-European and semi-local system that over hundreds and hundreds of years spread so that what we start to know as countries today sort of come from these lumping together of peoples based on this sort of bicameral system that they created in that way. And so the architecture that comes out of that time period is, holy crap, we need a bunch of castles and we need a bunch of churches because we are getting invaded and the only thing that's holding us together is our shared sense of religion. And so they built all this massive architecture for those purposes. What we see with Romanesque architecture is that it is inspired by Rome, and we see that in the types of materials that are used, although the concrete recipe had been lost. And a lot of the shapes will be the same, though. Round arches, flat stone walls, round towers. It is also going to be, Romanesque is going to be your classic medieval fairy tale, castle, cathedral architecture that is in popular culture. How did it get that way? It was inspired by the history that came before it from Rome and Byzantine, which a lot of us don't know or concentrate on or think about when we are thinking about the Middle Ages. Our first keyword for it is going to be heavy massing. Again, that's a general term for a concept. It's not a specific thing. But as I was saying, for defensive purposes, and because a lot of the very delicate engineering, like with aqueducts and things like that, have been lost, Romanesque is very much thick walls, big masses, strong arches that they knew would last a really long time. These people were sort of creating a civilization in Europe to this extent for the first time, and they wanted it all to go well and work, and they had a lot of experimenting to figure out how to recreate a lot of what the Romans had. And so we see, again, round arches, we see straightforward shapes, we see any decor or elaborateness of the massing being inspired by the Byzantines. This structure almost looks like it could be a cross-in square floor plan. And we're just going to see a lot of generally 1 to 2 to 3 to 4 story buildings, not huge stuff, but strong, clean lines, and very functional architecture, a lot of which is still around because it is really well built. And so with heavy massing, we can see the thickness of the walls, the smallness to the windows, makes this incredibly structural and strong. And with the confidence that we saw with the Byzantines, that they were able to get away with a lot of stuff, this confidence did not exist in early Europe, where they were trying to mimic what was going on before them. And again, for defensive purposes. So this tiny window that you see on the right, this would be a great window to like shoot arrows out of and not get shot very easily. And there's a lot of thought about that based on all of the invasions and all of the infighting that I was talking about at the beginning of this lecture. There was war constantly throughout all of this area. And so much of the architecture and much of society was centered around defensive uses, around who lived where together, and alliances and groups, and very early type political work to bring these structures up to a civilizational level of what they knew had existed in Rome but was now gone. And the Byzantine Empire was quite removed far to the east, quite a distance that they would only really get over to once they started doing the Crusades. And so we see a major vocabulary word for Romanesque being the round arch from Roman architecture. And I won't speak on that anymore. I think you're already quite familiar with it. But the round arch is omnipresent throughout Romanesque architecture, and it's one of your key ways that you can look at a structure right away and say, oh, it's Romanesque. But we see a lot of elaborate, almost Byzantine figural work and religious stuff. And a lot of that does come directly from the Byzantine influence. This, of course, looks quite Roman with the orange roof tiles and the structures and the round arches. And it just went on like this for quite some time. But we see things here that did not exist in the Roman Empire. We see complex columns, massive piers coming together with multiple column nodes. We see double columns and successive thickened arcades. Our next keyword is going to be blank space. And just like with Rome, Romanesque architecture features open space, empty, flat, open spaces on walls between decorative or functional elements. So we see a chance to catch your breath when you're looking at a structure like this. That's the wrong way. For all of these, a simplicity that feels very much like fairy tale-esque in a way. And you may take that for granted at first, but when we look back at Byzantine, or if we look forward to Gothic, what we're going to talk about in a second, is that's very much not the case with either of those, especially Gothic. And so blank space just refers to room between the elements. This would be considered quite decorative for Romanesque, and you can see even here there's quite a bit of smooth wall. The blind arcade. Blind arcades are very common in Romanesque architecture, and what that is simply an arcade that is not open all the way through. It is sort of intersected into the wall. These could be decorative, but they're also very, very structural. It's a way for a wall to get thicker towards the top, or to have thinness in a certain part of the wall so that you didn't have to have so much material. But overall, Romanesque architecture had a lot of material because they wanted to be extra, extra strong and last forever. And they wanted to have no doubts about the integrity of the arches overhead, and they had doubts. Here's another blind arcade. So each of these pictures has a blind arcade in it, or an arcade that is intersected by a wall. This quite Roman blind arcade. The Romans had blind arcades as well, but they didn't do it to the extent that all of the Europeans who practiced Romanesque architecture. And Romanesque is just a general term for all of the Roman-inspired architecture across Europe. There are huge variations. There are huge variations geographically and for time period. And I mentioned this word before, but it's a key word, pier. So instead of columns, you could have giant rectangular, blocky posts. Remember post and lintel construction? And these posts could be complex. You can see some of these are somewhat rounded and somewhat squared off. But a pier is quite simply just a large blocky thing that's holding up other stuff. So this is a massive arcade that is being held up on piers and not columns. They're kind of columns, but you get what I mean. And so piers could be complex, as I said before. They could appear to be made out of multiple nodules of columns and things like that. And they were just part of this tendency toward massiveness in Romanesque architecture, just to go extra on all of the strength and structural integrity. The drum column is also definitely directly related to that. Drum columns were massive round columns. So piers are square or nodules, and drum columns are round. And they would be so big that they would be made out of huge, thick stones, and then also they would be hollow in the middle, and they would fill them in with rubble and gravel and stuff just to fill them up. I think maybe that's where the word drum comes from. But there are many different types, but generally they were pretty smooth, not overly decorative. And they could hold up these massive, massive stone walls and structures that were part of Romanesque cathedrals and castles. And in Romanesque, we see for the first time stained glass, which of course is bits of colored glass being assembled into an image or a pattern using bent lead to hold the different pieces of glass together. And you could also paint on top of these. So the faces here would be painted onto the whitish, taupish colors of glass. A lot of the lines in the clothing are also painted. But this is very reminiscent of a lot of the icons and stuff that we see from Byzantine, as well as the mosaics that we see from Rome. Because they would be very much figural, they would have stories of important figures, whether they were religious or whether they were nobility. And this relationship between the nobility and the priesthood, as I said before, is forming the basis of this entire civilizational structure. And they could get quite weird, some of them. A lot of the stories from this time period are quite weird. And a lot of the sort of heroic imagery is also quite strange. As you can see here, it's very interesting. A cloister is 4 arcaded walkways around a central courtyard. And so this became sort of like an open garden that you would often see at an abbey or associated with other church architecture. They're quite lovely. If you ever live in New York or go to New York and go to the cloisters there, it looks quite a bit like this. And that's a medieval style structure that is built at the upper end of Manhattan. And it's just a place that in this time period, monks, other religious figures could hang out, have their garden, and sort of be at peace. And there were very many types of column capitals. Romanesque inherits Byzantine's tendency towards improvisation. And our next keyword is tympanum. And so Romanesque would often have these giant doorways, very elaborately decorated. Because the walls were so big and they were so thick, you had an opportunity to step your doorways down. Instead of just having a hole, you might have all of this tiered stepping because you needed to get, you wanted to reduce the opening in the wall as much as possible for strength and security. And so you would like step it down, and they had all this opportunity for a lot of decoration because you're cutting away a lot of stone or leaving a lot of stone out. So a tympanum is sort of like a pediment, if you remember that. The tympanum is the thing right over the door where it was an expanse of decorative work, a relief, and it was almost always figural. And so the tympanum is just the bit in these images that is the pointy bit right over the door. But all of this other stuff around the door, that has specific vocabulary words as well, which I'm not requiring you to know. But these statues on the door jamb, just to the side of the doors, those are called jamb figures. Unlike in Moorish and other Islamic architecture, in Romanesque and other European architecture, we see extensive figural work. Here's another tympanum with extensive figural work and jamb figures around it. And these were ubiquitous throughout the architecture. You can also see here there are many, many motifs, and we won't get into all of them, but we're going to look at several motifs, meanders and different shape motifs that are coming down the line. But as I said before, figural decor was huge. With the rise of Christianity, the importance of Christian figures and saints came to be a new mythos that replaced a lot of local pagan myths. Myths. And they wanted to include the status of those figures in their religion. And so these new churches that were being built were the central physical touch point to that religious practice. Very figural. As I said, we see some knights here jousting and maybe a battle going on. And they could be of many, many different subjects, an infinite number. But we also see in medieval art a real loss of the sense of proportion and perspective and scale that was so realistic in especially Byzantine, but also Roman art of all kinds. So when we see figures, we'll often see that they are misproportioned. They're too short, or they're weird, or they're too tall. Often the saints would be too tall. And we have seen this in the past, but what we also see is unrealistic proportioning based on the status of a figure. So you'll see art with a huge Mary and then like tiny saints all around her, and it's unrealistic, but it's based on their status, right? So many different types of relief work and column capitals, and many different types of figural work. So you can see here that the strange proportionality, like in the head on the image to the left, is very, very unique to the medieval period. It's an unrealistic proportionality that represents a loss of skill and ability that we saw with ancient Rome. But nonetheless, there's an incredibly complex sense of decor. The detail level here is very, very high. And even so, you might say that they are improvising beyond what was possible with the Byzantine Empire, which through a lot of this is still alive and going strong, but it's just so far away for the technology of the time period that it was an influence, but it was sort of like a distant influence. Here's some of the more interesting column capital decor that I was able to find. Very interesting. And so here's some more elaborate portals with tympanums and jamb figures. And some of these were quite good. I mean, there's quite a big difference between how nice this is and how interesting and yet disproportionate this is. This speaks to a lot of earlier, almost pagan artwork, and then this speaks much more to a very strong Roman influence. So our first motif is called Dog-Tooth Motif. And Dog-Tooth Motif was a motif of pointed shapes, and they could be spiky like dog's teeth, or they could be more 3D like the ones that you see here. They almost look floral in a way. You can see several motifs here, but dog's tooth is one of them. It's the spiky one that's going around in the second layer. We'll keep going. This is also dog's tooth. Here, dog's tooth is very clear what it is. It's the spiky bits. It almost actually looks like a dog's mouth. It's just sort of triangular. It's not even symmetrical or even. And again, we're in a time here where a lot of skill has been lost. And it's also being formed for the first time because in trying to emulate what was going on in Rome, they had to figure it out, and they had to learn it and teach themselves it a lot. Here we can see several examples of dog's tooth in different shapes, some of them looking more like dog's tooth than others. Another motif is the lozenge motif. And a lozenge is a motif of oblong shapes. They could be diamond or somewhat rounded, and kind of like a cough drop. And if we think about a lozenge cough drop, that kind of will help you remember the shape of what this is. We see some lozenges on the outer rim here. And there are many different types of lozenges. This diamond pattern would be considered a lozenge pattern. And this is a lozenge as well. I've saved the best motif for last for you here because this is called beak head motif. There are many, many other medieval and Romanesque motifs, but these are just some of the more prominent ones that I wanted to point out to you. But beak head motif is it's a motif featuring rows of faces with beaks or different strange mouth stuff. Usually animal, but sometimes fantastical, always fantastical, sometimes like mythical, and quite interesting and quite unique. Beak's head. You can see this one on the left. It's very much bird beaks and heads going around this this door here. And it was quite extensive. This was not just like a one-off thing, but it was found quite a bit. Our next keyword is turret. A turret is a tower that doesn't go all the way to the ground. So it's a tower that comes up out of a corner, and it would be a place to look out, to shoot arrows, to pour hot oil into your enemies. But that's what a turret is, and they could be quite expansive. They're visually very stunning. They could terminate in a spire of some kind, which is a later word. But these are all turrets, and as opposed to a tower, which would go all the way to the ground, these sort of stick out from a corner. And our next word is crenellation. And that sounds like a complicated word, but crenellation is just the up and down zigzaggy bits on top of a castle wall or a defensive or fortification wall. And it kind of looks like teeth. And the point of it is that you can stand behind it and sort of shoot your arrows through the hole, and then you can hide behind the pokey bit. But that's what crenellation is. It was a defensive structure. It's so much so that in England, where Romanesque architecture is also called Norman architecture, or the Romanesque architecture of England is referred to as Norman architecture, you had to have a license to crenellate. Which meant that the king had approved that you could build fortifications on your land. So here's some more crenellation on some towers with some blind arcades that are corbelled out away from the wall. And here's some more crenellation, quite old, but a lot of Romanesque architecture still stands today, or at least in extensive ruins, because of the incredible strength and size of the walls. And here is some crenellation over towers and turrets. Our next vocabulary word is keep, and a keep is the central tower of a castle inside the walls for the last line of defense. It would be a tall, typically squarish tower structure that you would fall back to as you were defending your castle, and it was not going very well. And it was very much a defensive structure with a lot of crenellation. So what we see here, this is a hilltop. The next picture is a little more clear. This would be called a motte, and this is not a vocabulary word, but they would build a big mound called a motte to build their keep on. And if the motte was big enough, it would have walls on top of it, and then inside that would be the bailey, which is like a courtyard in between the walls, and at the center of the bailey would be the keep. Here you can see a keep in the bailey. within the walls on a motte, and out there is probably the water is probably a moat, which you probably know is a sort of lake they would build around a castle to limit the number of approaches that could number of ways that you could approach the castle. So those are our words for Romanesque, and in general it was a very beautiful but a very straightforward sort of architecture. We're going to move now into Gothic architecture, which grew out of Romanesque. And in short, it was much more decorative. It was much more confident and capable in its engineering because they had spent a few hundred years learning and practicing, and they learned very quickly that they could go far, far beyond what the Romans or the Byzantines had done. Gothic architecture will continue to be built up until the 16, even 17 and 1800s. It's a type that spanned hundreds and hundreds of years, and it became the height of European architecture, and it was developed from Romanesque. And so we'll see a lot of influences coming from it. We'll see a lot of buildings that are kind of one and kind of the other. But overall, because of their stability that they had achieved in their society after many years of fighting, the Catholic Church did come to be a central power, or the main power, along with strong kingdoms that all of that generated a peace throughout the country, or throughout Europe, that allowed them to have a huge increase of economic and architectural learning and understanding. So with Gothic, we're going to see overall a lot of really delicate massing. As opposed to the heavy massing of Romanesque, we see that they were able to have much thinner walls, much larger windows, very delicate structures, very decorative structures. So throughout Gothic architecture, there is a practice of making things just for decorative purposes. And oftentimes Gothic architecture is seen as like Dracula's castle. It's scary. It's not as soaring and elegant as Romanesque might be. It's not typically your fairy tale castle. But I think that is short-sighted, and I think that there are a lot of really beautiful and elegant things about Gothic that you're going to see in these pictures that are really, really incredible. This, for instance, this flying buttress is a support structure for the wall, but is also incredibly elaborately decorative. And so this is what we're talking about when we talk about delicate massing. We see in Gothic that they used thinner, more decorative members to hold up other pieces. And so we get this sort of very delicate, lacy skeleton of a building instead of the big hulking masses that you saw with Romanesque. This building almost looks like a crown, almost like a piece of jewelry in the way that it is elaborately decorated. Our next keyword with Gothic is flamboyance. And flamboyance is a general concept. It's a showiness of decoration beyond giving form to functional elements, but having extensive structure for the purpose of appearance and complexity only. So all of the confidence that they had generated in their architectural practice allowed them to go absolutely nuts with the level of decor that they had. When you look at how lacy and frilly these buildings are, there is so much work put into creating them, because this is not made out of plastic, it's not 3D printed. Every single piece is hand carved out of stone, chipped away one little piece at a time. And this flamboyance arose probably because of the desire of the church and of the kingdoms to show their grandeur and their status and their importance. And when you're coming from such a historically important civilization such as Rome, and you're trying to match that status, then you want to go as far as you can. And so the practice of decor went to the utmost, and so much wealth was accumulated by the church as all of these civilizations wanted to have a central authority, that they were able to put as much as they needed into the practice of figuring this stuff out and making it more and more and more and more. to the point that it makes Gothic architecture immediately recognizable. It could be the most recognizable architectural form in all of human history. So our next keyword is the pointed arch. Quite simply, it's an arch that has a point on top. It's an incredibly strong arch. It was capable of holding up and maintaining even in incredibly delicate structures like we see on the left. There's very little internal support structure in this arch and with the foils above it, but that's totally fine because of the geometry of it. The pointed arch is something that we see throughout Gothic architecture. It's very common in churches and cathedrals today. The ribbed vault is something we've talked a little bit about before, but with Gothic, what it is instead of having an archway or a vault made out of huge blocks of stones, they could have their voussoirs and keystones cut down into very small, round ribs that were just as strong, could hold up the vaulting and could hold up the walls, and then they could fill in the negative spaces with filler thin facing material or plaster or whatever have you, because of the engineering capabilities that they had achieved. So they could have vaults and arches that were not entirely made out of big stones. Even in Byzantine, what we saw with the pendentives were structural. But in a ribbed vault, up into the Gothic era, a lot of this is all just being held up by the ribs itself. And it gave it a very graphic feeling visually, because all of the vaulting overhead is divided into these linear shapes. But that wasn't just aesthetic, it was actually structural. The structure of holding up everything is just in those ribs. So you can see that here in this diagram. You can see that the rib is a very thin piece that's going up to the keystone, and then what they call the web here overall. It is structural. Those stones are part of an arch, but the geometry of this makes it all much thinner and lighter than we would have seen even in Byzantine, but certainly in Romanesque. That led to very large open spaces, and it led to very grand cathedrals and castles. Here we can see the ribbing very clearly. And the ribbing got very elaborate up to the point of what we call tracery, which is another word we're going to be talking about in a second. But the relationship between the structural ribs and the decorative tracery became very complex. So they had a lot of time and effort to put into understanding this and mastering it over building thousands and thousands of churches. And here's a very clear example of very complex ribbing in this architecture. And here as well, very clear use of ribbing with plaster between. And this image is very kind of Dracula's castle, but what you can see is the clear difference in color and shape between the ribs and the web between the ribs. Spire is the next keyword. Spire, quite simply, is an elongated, steeply pointed top of a tower. And it's an impressive visual culmination of the tower that can be seen from very far away, and was very, very bold and effective in creating impressive status in a building. There are many different types, many different levels of decoration. Here we can see that these are decorated and carved almost to the utmost degree. With Gothic, we do see a level of complexity such as we saw with Moorish, say like in arabesques. And there was an influence of Moorish heavily that helped create Gothic. We probably would not have pointed arches without Moorish horseshoe arches, and we probably would not have the level of decor here without the influence of Moorish as well. So it really doesn't look like it, but as you remember, the presence of the Moors in Spain was something that very much the rest of Europe was very aware of, did not want to go to battle with them, and but they did. They were aware of them. They traded with them. They traveled, and there was certainly an influence amongst the architecture. And so these are spires. All of these are spires. Even the ones that are like roofs, like these, are spires just as much as these are. It's simply an elongated, pointed tower top. And even on modern churches, you will often see a spire, and it's like one of the, or maybe the only, church architectural practice that continues across styles from this period onward. The next word is flying buttress. And what a buttress is because the walls were really thin and the delicate massing overall was sort of just kind of laced together, and they wanted it to be very, very complex and delicate. A buttress is something that holds something up. So if you lean up against a door, you're buttressing it. And a flying buttress is when the buttress doesn't touch the ground below the point where it's supporting the wall. So these are flying buttresses. So what they are is it's a vertical pillar or post and an angled beam or lintel that is going out over space and connecting with the wall. And what they didn't want to happen was to have their thin walls buckle in the middle. They wanted the masonry at a certain joint to sort of push out and break in half. And so what they do is they wanted to push against that at the point they thought it was weak. And so they would put buttresses against the thin wall at the point where they thought the arch from above was kind of pushing on it that would make it go out. You can see that quite clearly in this diagram. The weight of the arch from above would be pushing down. And one of the problems with arches, of course, is that the weight is transferred in an outward direction. And if you want your walls to be super thin with giant stained glass in it, like Gothic practitioners did, you were concerned that the outward direction of travel of the energy and the weight might cause your wall to buckle. So they would put buttresses, and the most complex ones were these flying buttresses. But it gives you an incredible visual element. They are just beautiful and kind of off-putting as to what they could possibly be doing until you understand their purpose. So here's some more flying buttresses of a later time period when brick was back again commonly used. Tracery. Tracery is ornamental open stonework, as in a rose window or over a stone wall surface. It sort of evolved from the ribbed vaulting to become much, much more complex, almost like lace. And the remarkable thing about tracery is, as I said before, this was all carved out of stone. So when you look at a rose window like this, it's holding itself up. It weighs literally thousands of pounds, and it looks like a doily. And that is incredible. If you remember back to post and lintel, we're going to put sticks in the ground and have a stick on the top and stand under it, and now we're under shelter. And the Egyptians were so proud of that, and it was great. And the Greeks were so proud of that, and it was great. And the Romans were like, check out this arch. It's awesome. It's cool. But to do something like this, which is floating stonework in space, full of pieces of delicate glass, with every 3 or 4 foot block of that shape being made out of a rock that you have carefully carved to be a certain shape. And yes, there's mortar between the pieces, but it's all just sitting there because all the shapes are correct. That represents an achievement in craftsmanship that would be looked at as alien amongst early civilizations. And this tracery, too, represented a level of time commitment and ability that was unparalleled and just went on and on. And I know that I keep saying that every civilization got more complex and more hours were spent and more craftsmen worked. And there is a time coming when that is no longer true. And so the value and the interest of this and a couple more civilizations that are about to come is they represent the culmination of that, hours spent on something that could last hundreds or thousands of years. Whereas today, neither of those things are true for a lot of the architecture that we have, despite our technological advantage. Here's some more tracery in both the rose window and overhead with ribbing. Our next keyword is foils. So the trefoil, the quatrefoil, and the cinquefoil simply means these sort of nodule openings that a trefoil would be 3, a quatrefoil would be 4, and a cinquefoil would be 5. So they were decorative filler tracery of a simplistic or of a simple form that you would fill in to a window opening or some sort of other arched opening. So here we see several different types. Behind me there's a nice trefoil that would be in a church today. Here are, in the center at the bottom, there's a quatrefoil, and at the top a cinquefoil. Over here on the right there's a couple of different ones. Here's some trefoils. This is all quite straightforward, and I think you probably understand immediately what this is referring to. Here's some trefoils on top and some cinquefoils on the bottom in this blind arcade. And here's some more foils. It's just a decorative way to fill in a space. So this rose window is comprised of trefoils and quatrefoils almost entirely. Our next keyword is rayonnant. And rayonnant began as an obsession with stained glass and rose windows, to the point that they leveraged their ability to use ribbed vaulting and very delicate columns and very thin walls to make walls that were like entirely stained glass, like what you're seeing in this picture. All the different little individual dividers are doing so much work. The stone pieces between that are painted gold here, they're doing so much work to hold up the weight of the roof, which is still made out of stone, over all of this. And that's an incredible mathematical achievement. But rayonnant refers to late High Gothic style, where it became to be all about presenting stained glass, having a lightness and a brightness and a delicacy and a high level of decor. And so here's a very elaborate stained glass window where they have minimized the stone presence as much as possible, considering the stone is doing 100% of the structural work here. And this is the most delicate architecture that had ever been created at this time. Here's another massive stone glass panel. And here's another huge, I mean, the percentage of the area covered by glass here is shocking, considering the vast weight of the stone ceiling above it. And rayonnant became an architectural style that was just a subversion of, not a subversion, a subdivision, a subversion of Gothic. So much so that here we don't even see that much stained glass, but it is bright, it's light, it's celebratory, it's very much inspired by and related to the effect of rose windows and stained glass in general. The rose window, as we were just speaking of. A rose window is a round, typically massive stained glass window, very colorful and bright, featuring elaborate tracery. These are very common practice across all architecture of the time period, and they are still made today in some places, but often look like snowflakes or elaborate webs. And the complexity of the stained glass ranged from what we see here, which is quite old, to all the way up into something like we see here, which is very, very elaborate. As you see the stones getting smaller, you know you're going forward in time period because the architectural ability grew. And here the outside of some of these. So you can almost see the individual stones here that are holding all this together. And imagine building this and getting each piece up there before it was able to hold itself all together. A finial is a decorative knob or topper, often found on spires, but today it's also found on posts or curtain rods or any other type of a cane or a railing. So a finial for us is any sort of decorative topper. But in Gothic architecture, you would see them very commonly on spires or on other pointy decorative bits. Finial. A grotesque is a fantastical, often monstrous decorative figure, and that would be used on the building, on decor. These look like they're jam figures around a door in Tympanum, but you can also see that there are grotesques, these mythical or fantastical figures along with these saints. Maybe they are demons tempting the saints or something like that. But there was elaborate use of figural work and grotesques, almost to the point of being nonsensical and absurd because of the vast number and complexity of the grotesques. And I'm not sure where the inspiration for these comes from, but they were ubiquitous. And you might say, well, aren't these gargoyles? And no, they're very similar. But a grotesque is any mythical or fantastical figure that's used on a building like this. This is a grotesque. But what a gargoyle is a grotesque that specifically is tied into the gutter system of the building. And so to get water off of the roof and to control it, where it goes, and to get it away from the walkways that people are going to walk on below you, a gargoyle is a gutter grotesque. So the piping of the water away from the roof would go through the gargoyle, and the gargoyle would gargle it and spit it out in a place where they wanted the water to go. So here are some gargoyles, which are totally creepy and weird, but gargoyles specifically are hollow and help pipe the water away from the roof and away from the sidewalks. Here's some gargoyles. They're great to take pictures of when it's freezing out, because it's very hard to catch them when it's raining. Photographers don't want to take their cameras out in the rain, but they love to take them out in the ice. So these are gargoyles. Mullions. So I'm going to introduce you to a body of knowledge here that few people know about and much fewer people care about. But the difference between mullions and muntins. And yeah, most people are very confused by this, but it's okay. And it doesn't really matter. But mullions are vertical members that separate sections of a window. So on this picture on the right, the concrete colored gray thing in the middle, that's a mullion. And on the picture on the left, all the sort of vertical tracery that's separating sections of the window, those are mullions too. Here we see multiple mullions. So this vertical piece on the right, concrete colored again, between the two window sections, that's a mullion. On the left, in this tracery Gothic window, the vertical pieces that are concrete colored, if I can bring my mouse over here, these are mullions. And these are mullions too. This is a mullion. This is a mullion. And you can see the mullions here quite clearly. Large vertical pieces of stonework that separate window sections. Whereas a muntin is the piece that holds the glass in. In the UK, it's called a glazing bar, but it's very different than a mullion, but people usually call muntins mullions. And you'll see this come up again, so trust me, it's not quite as boring as it sounds. But muntins hold the glass in, and so a lot of windows have both mullions and muntins. The stained glass piece on the right just has muntins. This window on the left has muntins that are holding the glass, the panes of glass in, but you can see it also has mullions between the big sections of window right here. So these windows have both mullions and muntins. The muntins holding the glass pieces in and the mullions holding the window up. And this one on the right does as well, but this one on the left just has muntins. And this window has mullions that are holding the window up and separating the sections. And it has muntins. These are actually leaded pieces of lead with grooves that are holding the glass pieces together. So we had quite a few vocabulary words during this section, and I think they're pretty straightforward, but if you have any question about any of them, please let me know. Thank you very much for being in this lecture. This is really a beautiful time period that we're getting into with architecture here, and there are many, many different variations. I would really encourage you to research some of these terms and to research some of like the most beautiful Gothic buildings or whatever, because we're reaching a time where the achievement was really, really stunning. So thank you very much. I'll be reaching out to you soon, and I'll see you again in another lecture.